yeah. I think early on I was very interested in, on the one hand, strongly imagistic poetry, and on the other, very much in certain aspects of the avant-garde of the 60s and the 70s, especially surrealism, especially sort of the early John Ashbery, and I found that poetry to be exciting, but as I kind of grew into my 20s, I think I sort of felt that, well, it really didn't answer my experience. It was the experience of Americans my age that led them to that poetry, but in some sense, because even though I had come here when Eisenhower was president and I had grown up through the 60s, my status as someone who had come here from India as a small child and someone who kind of experienced the racial reality of America in a different way than my peers did, sort of made me feel that, maybe that poetry wasn't really adapted to my experience. So around the late 70s, I started looking out for other models. And I found people like W.H. Auden, whom I had read, of course. I mean, Auden was a famous and important poet all the time that I was first encountering poetry. I mean, one knew who he was, and he had been alive then, and he had died, in the mid-70s or early to mid-70s. And I had known his poems, but somehow he seemed to speak to me. The political interest and the relationship between the rhetorical interest in the poems and the political interest in the poems were things that kind of seemed to me more consonant with my experience than my peers' experience. And so that was a watershed in the late 70s when I wrote a more engaged poetry than I had written, and I sort of abandoned earlier experimental models for the sake of writing something that was fairly clear and straightforward, that had a limpidity to it. And then when I really made that allegiance, what was interesting was that I found that, oh yeah, a lot of these poets whom I had read but had not thought of as useful to me suddenly became extremely useful. Frost, for example, Elizabeth Bishop, who I learned a tremendous amount from. And I was reading her before she became a kind of, a universally acclaimed figure. I was reading her when she was still sort of a coterie writer. And Bishop and Auden and mid-century Lowell were people who represented a certain kind of classical order. So I guess what I changed, the simplest way to say it was that I kind of changed in my mid-20s from being a poet you could call generally and largely romantic to one who was generally and largely classical in my allegiances. And subsequently, I don't think I've changed that much. I think I've developed and grown, but I think the terms and conditions of my writing are still pretty much the same. Although I am now getting really interested in surrealism again, and really interested in, not just the Spanish surrealists, but the French surrealists. And of course, through that period, I've always read Ashbery. He's always been an important influence in the background. It's kind of whatever swims into your net in some way, and there are certain big, important ideas that I sort of have felt I had to address, and the poems have kind of moved to an idea and sort of tried to make that idea real and specific, something that's nebulous, even though it's clear as an idea, it's nebulous as a poem, nebulous as something dramatic and something that other people would find interesting. So there are definitely things like that, you know. And I will give you an example. I'm working on a poem now based on one of Goya's black paintings, you know, the great, great Spanish painter. And I saw that painting in the Prado years ago, and I always thought, oh, I have to do something with this painting, because it, and I usually don't write ekphrastic poetry, even though I consider myself a really serious consumer of visual arts. I've never sat there and written about a painting or felt the need to write about a painting. This image was so disturbing and violent to me, and I've known the image for a long, long time. So only when I actually saw it in Spain, and this was kind of now many years ago. I'd never been to the Prado, but I went there about 10 years ago, and that was an idea for a poem, even though I didn't know what the poem was going to be at all. And I sort of felt, okay, I'm going to write a poem about that, and I'm working on that poem now. And I've made ventures toward the poem over the years and never really gotten anywhere with it. And now I'm really kind of getting somewhere with it. And that's one kind of thing. But another kind of thing is that I'll just be walking along and a phrase will pop into my head, and that phrase will be incredibly suggestive, and I'll write it down and I'll just follow it where it leads. Without knowing where it's going to lead, without having any sense of a theme or a phenomenon I'm supposed to address. And suddenly it will develop, and it will start developing its own life. And then there's a gamut of things in between. That you sort of have a phrase that is related to an idea. You've sort of thought about a poem that has a theme in it that you might want to kind of recapitulate in some way. And, and then certain things happen in your life and you say, well, that requires my response as a poet. Well, there are two kinds of writers, right? The ones who write draft after draft after draft and slowly build the poem up that way, or the piece of prose. And the ones whose first draft and final draft are very close to each other because they write step by step and they don't finish. They might have an idea of where they're going to go, but they don't write draft after draft after draft. They just work on one draft until it's polished and finished. And I'm mostly the second kind of writer. I have written drafts and rewritten those drafts and changed those drafts, but I tend to be someone in my poetry, basically, whose first draft and final draft are not very far apart from each other. And if I can't come up with something that I really like to continue the poem, I will stop and come back to it later, rather than write something as a marker and then go on and finish a draft of a poem and then rewrite that draft. So I'm very so the editing process is a complicated and tortured one for me, in the sense that I'm always editing in my mind as I'm going along and making things better, and but never finishing a poem until it's actually finished, if that explains anything. It's really interesting. James Tate, the great American poet who died recently, I heard speak at a reading, and then there was a Q&A, and he talked about how he developed a process over time, and the process was this. He would go into his studio on the days that he was writing when he wasn't teaching, and he would write a poem all day. He'd work on it all day. And if it wasn't done by the end of the day, he would destroy that draft, destroy that poem, and never come back to it again. And he'd go the next day. Think how much discipline it must take to do that, to just get rid of it and start over the next day. But it also, he said, led to his most productive period. Just because he knew that ideas always come back, that the issue is really finishing, getting something done. And he wouldn't revisit the poem the next day. It was either finished then, or it was unfinished and it was destroyed, and he went on to another poem. And that sort of struck me as an interesting counterexample to the way people usually work. They tend to think of their drafts as precious in some way, that there's something there that they have to acquit, they have to sort of realize, they have to rescue in some way. And he didn't feel that way at all. And that's, I think, a really useful... It's a useful anecdote. I don't know if people can write that way. I don't know if I tried it. It was unbearable. I couldn't do it. I was going, oh my God, I can't just destroy this, erase it, and forget about it entirely. It was just so disorienting to me. But it was interesting, and it still is interesting. I think it mostly has to do with having a healthy relationship to your process. To not make it neurotic, to somehow make it reproducible, given your own quirks and idiosyncrasies as a person. And you have to figure something out for yourself that is the most effective. And for him, it was this. And of course, when he did this, it was long into his career. He had been a famous poet since the mid-1960s. He had tried every process, I'm sure. And, was very, very well known. And this was relatively late in his career that he came across this process of editing, or not editing, really, It's just anything editorial is taking place that day. And if it isn't done, it isn't done, you just go on. And it recognizes the value of the day. So I think with him it was very much a recognition after long experience of who he was as a writer and what was best for him in terms of his own psychology and his own relationship to things, And as anybody who writes poems knows, that you can make yourself miserable over something that's just not working and keep working at it and working at it and working at it and have it suck up a lot of your time. And I think he found a solution for that problem. My solution tends to be to beat my head against the poem until it gives, and get myself all bloody in the process. Well, the first thing is this. I will tell you another story. When I was a kid, I was living in San Francisco on Potrero Hill, and in an apartment with a bunch of people. And across the street, there was a Victorian, and a sculptor lived there. And I would run into him on the street, and he and I would talk to each other, and I would tell him that I had this ambition, I wanted to be a writer and stuff, and he would always look at me and he'd say, "A writer writes." A writer doesn't dream about writing. A writer, that's what a writer is. The definition of a writer as someone who writes is exhaustive. It kind of comprehends entirely what a writer is. And so that's the first advice I would give you. A writer writes, so you should write. And you might write badly one day, you might write badly 2 days, you might write badly for 50 days. but that's what you do. You write. And so you got to get up in the morning and you have to write and you have to finish things and stuff like that. So I think that is the first thing, that a writer is not someone who dreams about writing. A writer is someone who writes. And I think once you sort of establish that pattern, that discipline, that sort of recognition that this is the kind of thing you do the way someone who's training for a marathon trains for the marathon, by running, by getting up in the morning and running, all of the other things become much clearer. What form is appropriate to you, what your vision is, everything, what you require. The next thing, the other thing I would tell you is stick close to the writing that you love. Really fall in love with writers. And I think that's how people become writers. They fall in love with writing, right? They don't have a generalized idea that, oh, this is something I would like to do. They read something and they say, oh, this is really great. This speaks to me in this profound way. It's as if I wrote this. This is so real to me, And I have learned the most about writing from people who I've loved obsessively and passionately, and who I read and read and read, and whose influence was very, very clear to me at certain times. And so you should not stay very far away from the kind of writing that you really love, and celebrate that and read it. And the third thing is to also read generally, because you have to have an informed mind in order to write well. And so you should be reading a lot of literature and watching how it works, and also acquiring a lot of knowledge about reality, about the world. I think the writer I probably learned the most from was Elizabeth Bishop. And it wasn't necessarily inspiration, but real comfort with the way she went about things, and a real strong sense of her writerly character. But before her, I had read all of these other people who were extremely useful to me in terms of helping me develop my voice. People ranging from John Ashbery to James Wright to Galway Kinnell. And after her, I really came across a whole host of writers who helped me in bits and pieces. When I was kind of lost, I would read a writer like, say, James Schuyler, and he would kind of open something up for me. Or I would read George Oppen. And these were all writers whom I've read a lot, and they would give me ideas. And then there have always been these kind of counterexamples, like Sylvia Plath. I could never write a Sylvia Plath-like poem, but she sort of always set a boundary for me that I was reaching toward in some way. And so yeah, but influences are enormous and complicated. Auden's always been a huge influence on me, and and he helped me with my writing, but he also gave me an ideology at a certain point about writing that was very, very important. It allowed me to free myself from influences that weren't necessarily good for me, because they weren't consistent with my experience.